Welcome to another edition of Just Unsecure Cybersecurity series, where we explore key topics in information and cybersecurity, focusing on Africa and the world. I'm Babz, and as usual, your co-host,
Oh, nice to meet
Double O. Bob, as usual, before we go ahead, don't forget to subscribe. We need all the subscribers out there. So please subscribe to learn more from us. Today, we have an interesting guest. His name is Ronald Martey. He's a visionary cybersecurity leader with deep expertise in building resilient security frameworks across industries. He brings a wealth of experience in AI-driven security, innovation, regulatory compliance, and strategic cybersecurity leadership. Whoa. Is passionate about advancing data protection and digital sovereignty in Africa. Is committed to shaping the future through education, research, and impactful partnership. Yemi, what do you say about Ronald?
I can't say so much. I will allow him to say much more because he's also a FOB award winner. He has several certifications are like, what is he trying to do? But also a global CISO. So I'll be happy for him to introduce himself when we bring in him. So let's bring Ronald in.
Ronald, how are you doing, Ronald?
Hi, Babz. Hi, OO. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you for honoring us. We know for global CISOs, these are busy period. You know, those rush before everybody goes for summer. They're like, yeah, just get everything in. But we're happy to just have this your time and to be delighted. We're delighted that you're able to join, and all our viewers and everyone that learns from us will be able to gain something from you. Mark was making an attempt to introduce you, and he pushed it to me, and I cannot introduce. I don't have the capacity to do that, so I'll leave that to you. Please introduce yourself. Let us know much about you. Thank you.
Well, a couple of sentences. I mean, I'm an experienced cybersecurity professional with over a decade experience, spanning across multiple industries, banking, finance, telecommunications, technology. I work with technology companies like IBM. I'm currently based in the UK, working with a bank. And the role involves ensuring that critical data within the UK GDPR, any medical-related record or data is classified as special category data. And so my responsibility is ensuring, that this data is equally protected on all fronts. Thank you.
Did you see that? With everything that I've read about him on LinkedIn and what have you, he just shot it. I don't need to say more. Perhaps go ahead.
Straight up. Maybe I'll ask a personal question, because like your personal journey. And this is something our viewers know we always ask everyone that come. What inspired you to pursue a career in cybersecurity?
That's a very interesting question. So I would say two key things. I think the first point is the desire to be different, the desire to chart my own path. And I'll say the second point is about a movie I watched in 2006. And so I recall in 2006 having a conversation with some classmates of mine about what we wanted to do after school. And around the table, whereas a lot of them some were saying they wanted to be programmers, others wanted to be system engineers, others wanted to be network engineers, some wanted to even go into databases. I wasn't so sure at the time what I wanted to do. But what I knew for sure was none of the options they had proposed or appealed to me in any way. And so I left that discussion in deep thought about what I wanted to do. And I pondered over it for weeks. Then I chanced on the Takedown movie. And so the Takedown is a movie about one of the most famous hackers in the early 90s. And it's about a guy who was very smart, witty. But what I admired most about him was that he didn't use a lot of sophisticated tools and techniques at the time, to infiltrate corporate networks organizations in the US. He had three key traits, which really I found very amazing. So one, he had a curious mind. Two, he understood human psychology. And then the final one was that he was good at guessing passwords. And with these three traits, I mean, he was able to infiltrate a lot of organizations within the US, stealing sensitive data, including source code for a lot of proprietary softwares. I think for me, all through the movie, the question I kept asking myself was, a lot of organizations are investing so much money, I mean, in developing proprietary software. I mean, if only some of that money had gone into improving or bolstering their networks, perhaps maybe this supposed hacker will not be able to have infiltrated. And so, after watching the movie, I mean, I had a sober reflection, thinking through. So at the point, I mean, I realized that, look, security would matter. And in pondering over that, I didn't want to be a hacker. I mean, that wasn't the intention. But the goal was to say that it would be good to be a good cop. It would be good to be a good cop in a digital sense, helping these organizations who perhaps, I mean, do not know the technical know-how or knowledge, I mean, to protect their systems from these hackers or attackers, and ensuring that, I mean, they had the right controls and processes in place. And so that desire stayed with me for a very long time. So at the time, again, in Ghana, I mean, we didn't have a lot of security. Wasn't an IT security wasn't a function within a lot of organizations. Best effort, you had a few organizations that had IT, and then for people's IT responsibilities, there was cybersecurity or information security added to those roles. But I knew that eventually at some point cybersecurity would be relevant, and so again, uncharted path. Security was green at the time. I decided, look, this is what I wanted to get into. This is what I wanted to invest into. And I'm happy to say that I've made that my lifetime commitment. And all through my life, I've been working with various organizations, helping ensure that they're able to protect what truly matters to these various organizations, whether it's their digital assets, whether it's intellectual property, or whether it's the data they collect on customers. My goal has been to work with these organizations to help mature the information security posture and protect these organizations from bad actors and attackers.
You see that, Johnny? Inspired by a movie. Yeah. I think I'll align with what you talked about when I was also coming up as well. Everybody was doing MCSE. Everybody wanted to do Microsoft certifications. And I just knew something was missing. And then I came across something similar. So I was just going to go for it. And we were never wrong. So
exactly, we were never wrong. We were never wrong. And I think for me,
That's the
it helped. It helped.
Yeah.
It prepared me for my role as CISO for the biggest bank in Ghana at age 35. Because I started very early, so as far back as in 2010, I had done my CompTIA Security Plus. I'd done my CEH in that same year. I did my CISSP and CISM in the same year in 2011. And so from there, I mean, I had gigs moving on from a telecom company onto financial institutions and onto IBM. And then when the bank came calling, I said, why not? I mean, it would be a good opportunity to put on my experience and knowledge, I mean, to bear in an organization that didn't have an information security function at all. And so I had to go in and then build that function from ground up. And I'm happy to say that I left a legacy, and that legacy still lives on. I mean, the team there are still doing some great work.
Beautiful. I think, like Yemi said, we all started all early. That's why we're all still young and still in, pursuing the information security space at a very high level. So we are all pioneers in that perspective. So for me, I want to dive deep into the question of the day.
Yeah.
Data security and sovereignty from an African perspective.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, who truly owns African data when it's hosted in a foreign cloud? What is your take?
So I think there are two key players with regards to who owns Africa's data. So there are the legal players, or we call the legal owners. So this typically will be your data controllers. So it could be government institutions or agencies. It could be financial institutions. It could be telecom companies. It could be fintechs operating within Africa. So legally, they own this data. And then we have the practical owners as well. I mean, these are the players who can actually control the data. So controlling the data here with regards where the data is stored, who can access it, who can back it up, who can delete it, etc. And oftentimes, that part of the process is outsourced to foreign companies. You just alluded to the fact that a lot of this data is stored on cloud platforms. Beyond cloud platforms even, I mean, for a lot of foreigners own data centers, I mean, within some regions in Africa as well. So I think who has control of where the data is stored is actually the controller of the data. And so within the African context, I see a gap, a data sovereignty gap, where a lot of African countries do not own their data. Legally, they own it, but practically, I mean, the data is owned by someone else.
Thank you for that. You mentioned something about data sovereignty, and someone might just be listening. Well, what does data sovereignty really mean? And so that's why I thought it might be a good way for us to educate some of the listeners who doesn't know what that means. Yeah, go ahead.
So essentially, data sovereignty is any entity or party who has control, who governs and can control and can benefit from data in a strategic way, in a political way, and in an economic way as well. So if you can govern, control, and then reap benefits from that data, then you have data sovereignty.
That means you are the one that has the sovereignty. So if, for example, we are hosting a data in Europe and Europe is the owner of that governance, that means invariably they own the data.
Yes, I mean, so technically, what then happens is that if you have data technically stored, I mean, outside the jurisdictions of Africa, in any geolocation outside Africa, the laws in that country apply to that data as well, technically. And so if you take a look at the US Cloud Act, for instance, it mandates law agencies, I mean, within the US, to have access to any data that resides on US tech companies' servers, whether the service sits within US or even outside the US. So I mean, clearly there's a gap with regards to surveillance and there are other risks there as well.
Yeah.
Well, but going to what you've just even said, that's a big question mark, especially for the African governments, because there are not that much infrastructure in place from an African perspective. You can count the number of data centers there are in Africa compared to Europe, compared to America. Is that not an issue on its own? Because right now you have the big 4 or big 5 data centers, and they're all in Europe or they're all in America. We do have some now coming up and springing up, but I think from your perspective, it can a continent or a country be digitally sovereign without owning its own critical data infrastructure?
The simple answer is a no. So if you look at digital sovereignty, I look at digital sovereignty in 3 key pillars. So there's an infrastructure part of it, there's a data, and then there's a regulatory part of it. So the infrastructure sovereignty bit, I mean, you're looking at who owns and controls cloud platforms, your data centers, your networks. Okay, if you look at data, you're looking at who controls the collection, storage, the processing, and analyzing of that data. And then the regulatory bit looks at who enforces, who enacts laws and even enforces them. And I think that if the first pillar, if you're not in control of your infrastructure, then it weakens the other 2 pillars. It weakens the other 2 pillars.
Yeah. There's a follow-up question for me in that regards, right? In GDPR. GDPR is a strong privacy policy in the world. So how does that, just to digress a bit, how does that really stays with data sovereignty? Is it only for individual, or is it because a country or EU propagate that law that makes governance of the data of their citizens a lot tighter, or that doesn't have any relationship with data sovereignty at all?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, a very good question. So one of the points on digital sovereignty is that a country's data protection laws should be applicable to its citizens' data assets, irrespective of where that data is stored. Okay. And if you look at GDPR, I mean, a lot of African countries' data protection laws get inspiration from the GDPR. I think the gap with a lot of African data protection laws is the lack of enforcement. But again, to the GDPR bit, I think that as far as enforcement is concerned, I mean, if an African startup is collecting EU citizens' data as part of rendering a service, and there's a data breach, for instance, EU regulations are likely to apply, I mean, to that African startup. I'm not so sure about the vice versa, where an EU organization or an EU company or entity is processing African data sets and there's a breach. Whether African regulators would have that gravitas, I mean, that power, that clout, I mean, to be able to enforce or apply sanctions. So it's, what's the word? I think that you call it asymmetric enforcement. I mean, the enforcement is not uniform, you know.
Yeah.
And I think it boils down to influence. Yeah.
I could not agree much more. And this leads to my second question, because you nailed it. Should Africa be focused on an African equivalent GDPR, or should it be localized like we have the Nigerian data protection? I know Ghana has, I know South Africa has the POP or something, but it seems everybody's doing their own. Shouldn't we be united in a way to say this is an African GDPR equivalent, and all African countries, back that? Because right now we're all individualistic, which is the norm, but it's not helping us as a collective, whereas the EU are doing theirs as a collective.
Yeah. So again, I mean, you are spot on. I think that there should be harmony across all the data protection laws within Africa. It's very important to reduce even bottlenecks when it comes to trade, And so this leads me to the point about AfCFTA and the proposal on digital trade. I mean, which was published in 2024. And I think that proposal is a very good proposal. I mean, that proposal I think there's a future in that proposal if all African countries rally around it. And the key tenets, I mean, within that proposal on digital trade is ensuring cross-border data flow, ensuring data localization, ensuring the cybersecurity, and also ensuring data protection and privacy. And I think that with that proposal would help align a lot of Africa's data protection regulations with regards digital markets and how these laws can help streamline trade from a digital market perspective. So whereas AfCFTA is more from a trade point of view, I mean, the digital aspect of it, I mean, is what is pushing for a lot of these harmonization in data protection laws. But beyond that, I mean, if we lay the foundation with this proposal on digital trade, I think that we can build on that as part of harmonizing Africa's data protection laws. I mean, also, I think that on the AU bit, I mean, there was a Malabo Convention, which I think needs to be improved on. I mean, the first draft or the current version, I mean, hasn't got a lot of teeth. And so with all the regulations ongoing, I think that Malabo Convention needs to be looked at and then improved on. And then hopefully, I mean, that now becomes the framework through which all the African countries can collaborate and partner.
A follow-up question with that, that's at the policy level, which is right. I agree with that, because when you write something on the paper and enforcement is a different thing entirely. Well, now that's there for the regulators, for the government. What can African startups do to help this?
Again, a very good question. I think African startups can become agents of digital sovereignty. And they can do that in a couple of ways. So whereas governments set policies, African startups are responsible for developing infrastructure, ecosystems, and applications. And as part of that process, they also determine where data lives or can sit. Okay. And I think that African startups can start by ensuring that they are the applications and ecosystems sit on local data centers.
Hmm.
They are leveraging local storage platforms. Because it's only when the data sits within your country and you have citizens, in control of that infrastructure, that you own the data. If it's outside, like I said, it's subject to foreign laws. And I've mentioned, something like the US Cloud Act. And the fact that, it gives agencies the right to access the data without approval from any African government. It's general, across. I'm just using Africa because we're talking about
Yeah,
Africa.
of course.
But it doesn't allow stakeholders to gain. So if a US agency wants to access data sets on Ghanaians or Nigerians, for instance, typically, unless there is an executive agreement in place between US and, say, Ghana or Nigeria, they'll just go to the tech company and say, look, give me the data.
Yeah.
It doesn't go through any government approvals or court approvals. This undermines Africa's jurisdiction,
Yeah.
and there are surveillance risks tied to that as well.
So I want to ask a question, a thought-provoking question, because now you see people saying hybrid, hybrid, which means either the data is stored locally or and something is outside of the country. Like let's just say the API, for example. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
How does that fall? How does that, from a sovereignty perspective, is the data still owned if it's local, but because the data is still verified, or should I say there's some kind of communication outside of Africa, who still owns that sovereignty?
So I think that sovereignty is better than nothing. Okay. So if you get to a point where there is hybrid, but at least the data stays within the jurisdiction of a country.
Yeah.
But then the API calls, etc., sit in another country. Again, yes, through APIs, if that processing is happening on servers that belong to US tech companies, for instance, then there's some semblance that the data can still be accessed under the US Cloud Act. But again, for me, I think that it's because the data is now housed within Africa. There's some control by African governments of that data, which sits within their fiscal geolocation.
Yeah,
I think I agree with that. But like you said, as long as they are able to have access, there's nobody can stop them from duplicating the data and putting it on their own.
Well, true.
Exactly.
So again, I'm saying, so this leads me to a point where I think that for Africans, developing or investing in our own scalable cloud platforms is very expensive. Okay. So it makes sense that within the medium to long term that African countries come together, maybe a group of West African countries come together and then build their own cloud platform. East African countries come together and then invest and build their own cloud platforms. But I think that within a short time, I think what is important is strategic partnerships. And we've seen that strategic partnerships happen in places like South Africa, where Microsoft and the AWS have local data centers, within South Africa. It's a good start. Through that, we're able to, what is the word? Train local indigents on new skill sets. And then also help these local indigents appreciate the technology. And then long term, taking steps to ensure that we are collaborating with African countries to build our own regional data centers or cloud platforms, and then storing our data rather than giving it all to foreigners. To control and have the US Cloud Act mandate this data to be made available or accessible at any time without any approvals from governments and courts on the continent.
Absolutely.
I know that we have the AfCFTA, African Continental Free Trade Area.
Yes.
Do you see it as a platform for harmonized data protection laws?
I do, and I think I alluded to the point earlier about AfCFTA publishing the protocol on digital trade, and I believe that can become a foundation or a blueprint. To deepen collaboration at the regulatory level or align regulations data protection regulations in Africa. I mean, at that level, across digital markets in Africa. Through trade, I mean, obviously, again, I mean, everybody's looking at using trade and how we can prosper. Each African country can prosper through that. But then if you look at it from a digital sense, then it's not just goods and tariffs anymore. We are now looking at data on customers, how do you protect that data localization, data governance, and cybersecurity. And so once there's that proposal or protocol, I mean, to harmonize data protection regulations in Africa to reduce bottlenecks when it comes to trade, I think that becomes the starting point, and then we can build on there to deepen that harmonization of African laws and frameworks.
I want to ask one other personal question. Like, if you were an African advisor, like, what would you advise African governments from a data security perspective, as well as what would be your first policy of recommendation? Let me put it like that.
That's a good one. So I think what I would advise is, and again, before I come to the policy, I think that data within Africa must be treated as a sovereign resource. Just like we have land, raw minerals, rare minerals, oil and gas. I think that data should be treated as a sovereign resource. And I'll explain why. So to the policy point, I think what should happen is that there should be a national critical data governance framework that is established. I mean, across African countries. And a lot of countries are doing that today. So today you look at Qatar, you look at Saudi Arabia, even South Africa. I mean, they have this data governance frameworks. And essentially what it does is that, I mean, it helps classify and identify data. So your biometric data on citizens, election records, defense documents, data residing on health systems, data residing on telecom systems, and even financial systems. These are critical data. And so once you identify this data, it makes sense that you now come up with a law to say, look, data which is classified as sensitive at no point should leave the shores of our country. And this ties into the Africa startup point that I made. So if there's such a policy in place, then African startups who are into fintechs, who are into health products, will look within for platforms that can host their infrastructure and storage platforms rather than hosting on AWS or on Azure. I mean, that probably will store the data outside Africa's jurisdiction. And again, like I've said, I mean, once the data is stored outside of jurisdiction, the laws in those countries apply to that data.
Correct.
And so it makes sense that we begin to look within now. I mean, ensuring that we take full control of our data. I mean, to avoid geopolitical exposures as African nations.
Oh, I know you want to ask a follow-up question. I still have more questions, but let me allow OO to cut in.
Go ahead.
I know we can go on this policy. One thing is, he has also talked about his experience right now in the health sector, and especially in the UK and the banking sector in the UK as well. So those are real experience. So if someone wants to get into the field of cybersecurity, like yourself, if you look back on how you came across, what would you advise?
Well, I think that for me,
changed since we've all started.
Oh, yes. But I think that for me, it starts off with passion. I mean, I'll say before you get into anything, I mean, you need to be passionate about it. Because if you want to get into cybersecurity, I mean, there'll be hurdles that you will have to cross. Cybersecurity is not, and I hear a lot of people now. I talk to a lot of people now, and it's more about, I mean, I hear there are a lot of opportunities. I mean, there's money to be made. And I tell them, look, yes, there's money to be made, but how far do you want to go with your career? And for me, for instance, I think the goal for me is to be recognized among the top 10% in my field globally. And so that's what fuels me. Okay, so I have that passion, that drive. And so continuous, I think I heard you say before we started talking about the number of certifications I have. I mean, it's not so much chasing the paper. I mean, it's chasing knowledge. And wherever that knowledge is, I want to explore it. I want to know it. I want to add it to what I already know to improve who I am. I want to be able to operate at a global level. I want to be able to be recognized. I mean, for the value I bring to the table. And so it's passion. I mean, something should fuel your hunger, your appetite, your drive. And so the first question is, why do you want to get into cybersecurity? Are you passionate about it, or you are in it because of the money? And oftentimes, I mean, if I speak to people and they say it's the money, I always go like, look, yeah, probably maybe find something else, because cybersecurity is hard. I mean, you
Tell me about
meet a lot of roadblocks, and once you
all
are
the
there, I mean, you
skills.
need to persevere.
All the skills you
You need to
need,
persevere.
it will come out. Your soft skills, your hard
Exactly. Yeah.
skills, everything.
Exactly. So passion helps you persevere. So if it's not passion and it's for money, at some point you stop and say, "No, I can't do this again."
That's true talk. I'm going to ask another question because this is quite interesting for me, because
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier in the conversation that enforcement is a big problem.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I know, for example, I'll say Nigeria because I'm from Nigeria. So we have lots of laws, lots of frameworks, lots of advisory. The problem is the enforcement. And when guys like you, me, we are in quote jackpine, how do the people that are there, how do you encourage them to be able to enforce something they have little exposure about enforcing? What would be your guide or your suggestion? Because all the three of us right now, we're experienced. We're
Yeah.
experienced. I can say that confidently. We're experienced. Also, there are some guys in Africa. Don't get me wrong; they are also experienced. But I have noticed that once they reach a certain level, the opportunity to go seek more experience, just like us, is there. So how do we now say, look, the people coming up, this is what you need to, this is how you enforce? Because you said it earlier, enforcement is the main thing, not the document itself, or having all the documents out there. How do we ensure people can enforce?
So it starts with recognizing that you have a problem. I think that's where it starts from. If you know you have a problem, I say there's nothing new under the sun. Okay. If you're a data protection commission or authority in any African country, and you know you have gaps in enforcement, you know you have gaps across the value chain, I think this is where partnerships come in. Partnerships with agencies such as the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, for instance. I mean, will help deepen or close those gaps, getting people to do exchange programs, coming into the UK, working with the ICO office, for instance, getting to understand how they do things, going through various use cases, and taking that experience back home and ensuring that we are building stringent policies and processes, and also having the mechanisms to roll out and enforce these things are key. So again, I mean, nothing new under the sun. There are developed countries who are already doing it. How are they doing it? Partner with these countries, learn, ask your questions. They probably would have done it in a different way, a way that you haven't thought about. And then look at the solutions and then come back home and then customize them within African context and then roll them out.
We don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Absolutely.
No, you don't.
Exactly. And
No,
that
you
leads to
don't.
my next question. For partnership, for
Yes.
cloud, for you mentioned the big cloud organization, should
Yes.
African countries be looking at partnering or building their own? Because you mentioned building theirs, but you also mentioned
Yeah.
what happened in South Africa, that they're
Yeah.
partnering. Which one is more viable from an African context?
I think realistically, at the moment, I think it makes sense to partner. Partner in the short, medium term, but then with a long gaze of wanting to build your own through collaborating with other African countries in the near future.
Okay. That's good. I'm not asking more. I think I'll leave the rest to
No, what I don't have any
I've
question for Roland anymore.
I've drained all my questions.
Yeah, I don't have. I think it's exhaustive enough. I quite understand. We need to start treating data sovereignty just like we treat money laundering. Mhm. If we see
Exactly.
if you see data as the new oil or the new money, then we will treat it differently. The only thing we don't see it that way. And if
Yeah.
you go ahead in the public, everybody else is making money from our data. Data is
Yes.
king. Yeah. So we don't say it yet in Africa. If we say that our data is the new currency, then I think government and everybody else is going to take it much more seriously because everybody treats
Spot
on
on.
paper money as a good valid currency. So everybody's saying, yeah, and fraud. Oh, what have you? And we build system around fraud, around that, but we don't build so much around data.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. So that's a good way to kind of say what, from your perspective now in your career and where you've reached, if you were 10 years younger, which you are right now, what would you advise your younger self to fast track where you are?
That's a tough one.
Make it 20 years then.
I think that I probably have gotten into privacy a bit more, a bit earlier.
Mm,
So oftentimes information security is more with the assets, protecting the assets, protecting,
mm,
yeah, I'll say the assets. The assets are like the containers. Okay. There's very little emphasis on what sits within the container itself, which is the data. And like O has mentioned, I mean, data is a new oil. It's very important to understand the processes around data. I mean, data is dynamic. Okay. From my experience, I will tell you that it's easy to identify all the assets within the organization, but it's very difficult to do a data inventory because of the dynamic nature of data.
100%.
And on the back of all the data breaches that you hear on a daily basis, if you are building an information security program and not focusing on an inventory of the data, how data is coming in, how it's leaving the organization, who has access to that data, who you are sharing that data with. It's like you do the platform, but your legs are outside. If you don't know who has access to that data, then you have all these data breaches ongoing because of some of these issues. Some of these basics have not been addressed properly. And so I think what I'll say to my younger self is probably maybe, yes, as I started the journey in cybersecurity, along the way, I should have probably also started early. I mean, with a privacy bit. I'm sure perhaps maybe I probably will be somewhere higher than I am now.
Even higher? Can you imagine a global CISO is still something higher? That means the president of Africa. Okay.
he, he wants to be the top 1% of the 1%. So there will be a title there waiting. There's one other after CISO, there's something he has not told us. There's another thing there. So
Yeah.
okay. Oh,
It's a privilege to connect with you, and
same here.
it's a privilege to say a global CISO sit down. And it's an humbling situation. So please, we'll keep in touch. By the way, keeping in touch. If anybody wants to reach out to you, where can we find you, or can they find you?
Oh, I'm very active on LinkedIn. So if anybody wants to find me, I mean, just search my name on LinkedIn. I'm very active there. I've gone back to my second love, which is writing, and so there are a lot of articles that I'm publishing. I've published, I think, 3 within this month, and so people can go there and take a read.
Fantastic. I'm taking a cue from that. When the global CISO goes into writing, I should get my pen as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a lot to learn from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ronald. Really appreciate
Thanks.
your time. and time taken out to have this session with us. We know you're a busy man, so thank you very much. And I think that's all from me and OO. We'll round up the show right now, and we can only say thank you once again. And to our viewers, thank you for listening, and thank you, Ronald, and really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Whoa, so that was a great session. I mean, a global CISO talking about privacy and sovereignty of data from an African perspective. He laid down everything. Well, I know I asked lots of questions, but I know that he laid down every single thing that the viewers would want to know more about. As in, I don't know about you, but I learned quite a lot.
That's a lot to learn, and that's a lot to digest and to see how that can play out in real enforcement. And also some of the things I picked from him. Who's better to talk about data sovereignty and data privacy, if not a global CISO, right? That means he's seeing data, he's seeing across different regions, across different continents, and I think it's a good way for even people or organizations who are trying to balance what it is and data sovereignty to learn from this and to be able to define a policy. And the startups to be able to say, yes, if we want to really defend our own sovereignty in Africa, we must enforce our data to be local. So, but I really learned a great deal from him.
I could not agree more. And like to everybody watching and listening, remember, ensure your data is localized. And if you need any help, reach out to Ronald, us, and we'll walk you through some steps. So apart from that, you know what to do. Subscribe if you enjoyed this, and watch out for the next session. Thank you all. Out from Babz
and OO. See you next
time.